So the first thing I want to talk to you about is a little bit about the history of ocean noise, because Hawaii has played a pretty significant role in the history of ocean noise. And it all started here in Maui, really, a lot of it, in that I started coming here in about 1985, and I started studying the effects of boats on whales. And at that time, if any of you older people are here, you might remember that people were really upset about parasail boats. Do you remember? Does anybody remember that? Only one person. Shows how old I am, 2 people. So there used to be parasail boats out here pulling people in parachutes behind these boats, going really fast in the water and almost running over whales. And one researcher documented that actually whales were moving offshore because, you know, they were so harassed by these boats moving fast and erratically. So the Hawaii State Attorney General's office approached me and asked me if I would testify for them because they wanted to ban the parasail boats during whale season. And I was studying the effects of boats on whales, so I said I would. You know, we went to court. I talked about the fact that I had data showing that boats impact whale behavior. They make whales stay underwater longer. They change their direction of travel. They definitely respond to boats in a you know, probably not a very good way. But the judge didn't care. He ruled against the state. So I thought, well, I think what I should do is go out there and actually study those parasail boats per se, because the original data was on just all boats. So we did a study on parasail boats, and we found that, I won't go into the details of the entire study, but we had 2 areas, one with parasail boats, one without parasail boats. And we found that the one with parasail boats, the minute those boats started operating at 10 a.m. up at the Hyatt, it was up at Kaanapali, the whales disappeared. I mean, we never saw a whale in that area once the boat started operating. But the other area down at Oluwalu, where there were no parasail boats, we continued to see the same number of whales all day. So it was a black and white, clear-cut study that those parasail boats were displacing those whales from the nearshore waters. So we went to court again. I thought, wow, this time we've got it nailed, right? I mean, this data is, you can't even argue with it. Well, the judge wasn't buying it. I don't know if he didn't believe me, or maybe he got paid off. I don't know what was going on, but again, he ruled against the state. So I sent my data to the state legislature. I think that was in 1990. And that summer, the state legislature passed the law banning the operation of parasail boats in Hawaiian waters where there are a lot of whales from December 15th to May 15th. And to this day, that's why you don't see parasail boats out here in the wintertime. So, and actually, of course, I was like persona non grata with the parasail people. It was not good. But, you know, they're still making lots of money for half of the year, right? No question about that. So I was asking myself, what is it about these boats that are affecting these whales so much? And of course, the logical thing that comes to mind is what? I mean, what is it about a boat that is going to affect a whale? I mean, it might be moving erratically, but what are whales going to be really sensitive to? Noise, right. So it's the noise. But, you know, you've got to document that. So I actually started, you know, measuring the decibel level of engines. And we would be standing up on the hill, you know, on a cliff, and we would call a boat to come in up to 100 yards, which was a legal limit. That's how close boats can get to whales. You probably know that in Hawaii. I had a permit so that I could get closer than that. I had a research permit, but I wanted to stay at that level because I knew that's where most boats would be. So we would come in at a certain speed. We would know exactly what the decibel level of the boat was, and we would, you know, study the impact of that boat coming in on that whale. And what we found was that, you know, a noise level of about 120 decibels, those whales didn't like it at all. I mean, they were out of there. And they would swim 2 to 3 times faster than they normally did, often, to get away from the boats. So it was pretty clear that, again, that they didn't like the boats. Other studies had shown, and some of them were observational studies with big tankers, large ships. By this time, people around the world were studying the impacts of boats on whales, and we all found that about 115 to 120 decibels. Decibels, that is the level of measurement that is used to signify the intensity of a sound. And at about 150 to 120 decibels, which is about the sound of my 25 horsepower engine that was on my 15-foot Zodiac, running very slowly, and if you were 100 yards away, that was about 120 decibels. So it's, it's loud, but it's not going to make you deaf, right? So that's 120 decibels. Whales start to avoid definitely at that level. It was very clear from research all around the world. So about that time, I learned that the Navy was going to come to Hawaii. This was in 1998, and they were going to come here in March of 1998, and they were going to do a month-long test on humpback whales to see how they reacted to high-intensity active sonar. Now, I didn't know much about, in fact, I didn't know anything about high-intensity active sonar at that time, except that it was very loud. I wasn't sure how loud, but I knew it was extremely loud. And then when I found out how loud it was, I found out that it can go up to about 240 decibels. So look over here. So this, I don't know if you can see it, but 120 decibels they avoid. The decibel scale is logarithmic. So if it's 130 decibels, it's 10 times louder than this. If it's 140 decibels, it's 100 times louder. If it's 150 decibels, it's 1,000 times louder than where they avoid, okay? They're already avoiding here. 180 decibels is 1,000,000 times louder. And it just goes on like that until you get up to like into the trillions. So 240 decibels, I think, is 10 trillion times louder than 120, which they don't like to begin with. So obviously, I thought this is probably going to kill them. I really did think. At that time, I thought this will probably kill them. So, nobody seemed to be saying anything, but I was pretty upset, so I called a lawyer at Earthjustice in Honolulu, and I said, "Are you aware what they're going to do with the whales around here?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, what can we do to stop it?" And he said, "We can try to get a court restraining order." So we did go to court, and I tried to get a restraining order to stop that 1 month of testing on the humpback whales. And I had to go home to work on the East Coast to teach, but I had a research team here, and they agreed to stay, and they went over to the Big Island where the testing was going to be, and they were going to collect data about the impacts of this sonar on the whales. And when they went out to collect the data, we filed the lawsuit to try to get the restraining order. They started to collect data. I think it was the first day they were collecting data. They called me at the end of the day. They were pretty hysterical. They said what had happened was that they saw a calf, a humpback whale calf, without its mother. And it was without its mother the entire afternoon, and it was frantic. It was breaching. It breached, I don't know, maybe 70 times. It tail slapped about 300 times. It peck slapped about 600 times. I mean, it was an absolutely frantic calf. It finally got dark. We couldn't, watch it at night. But by that time, by the time it got dark, the calf was exhausted. I mean, just lolling, barely able to move in the water. And I called the National Marine Fisheries Service, which had authorized these tests, and I said, "Listen, you got to stop this. This is what's happening." In fact, this is what I said in the lawsuit that we filed. We said it's likely to separate mothers and calves. Sound of this intensity, they're not going to be able to stay together. They can't hear each other. Right? And that's exactly what happened. But and in fact, they were supposed to stop the testing if that kind of unusual behavior happened. They agreed it was unusual behavior, but they did not stop the testing. So my guess is that that calf was eaten by sharks. I mean, obviously it starved to death because his mother wasn't there. And then we found 2 other separated calves in that 1 month period. So we found 3 separated calves in a relatively small sonar testing area in a 1 month period. In all the years I've been coming to Hawaii, I have never seen a separated calf maybe somebody has seen one, I don't know, but you just don't, it doesn't happen. And so to have 3 in 1 month in that small area, of course it was due to the sonar. So that was kind of my introduction to the possible effects of sonar on whales. We did not win that lawsuit. We were not able to get a restraining order, so they did go ahead with the testing for 1 month. The ultimate impact of that testing, what happened was the Navy hired some marine mammal scientists to do the testing. The ultimate impact was that, well, the other thing that happened was Animal Welfare Institute brought people over to get in the water around the Navy ships, so they couldn't turn on the sonar at that time because it was too dangerous. Now, it was interesting because they said, well, it's dangerous for humans, it might really harm them, so they couldn't use the sonar when people were in the water. So the people were able to stop the testing about 1/3 of the time. Well, don't you think if it's going to harm people, it's going to harm whales? Of course, they didn't, they didn't agree with that. But they were able to stop the testing about 1/3 of the time. And they found that whales, many of the whales, about 80% of the whales stopped singing when the sonar was on. The ones that did sing increased the length of their song by 30%, by about 1/3. And of course the issue for that, we don't even know exactly why these whales are singing, but people think, at that time people thought it had to do with reproduction. Now we think that may not be true. But anytime you affect an endangered species and you change their behavior to that degree, if they're singing 1/3 longer, they're putting out 30% more energy. And that's not good. You're changing their energy budget. But what I later found out was the Navy never tested the sonar at its actual 240 full deployment level. Most of the time it was at 140 or 150 decibels, way below 240. So the Navy concluded, okay, we tested it and we didn't find any dead whales, so it's okay to go ahead. Well, they didn't find any dead whales because it was only at 140 to 150. It was kind of sneaky because in their report, they never said that in the body of the report, but in the appendix, they had one little sentence that said, well, we never really deployed the sonar at its full intensity. So if you missed that one sentence in the appendix, you never would have figured that out. So that was my introduction to noise in Hawaii. They actually did test that sonar on whales off of California as well. The Navy was doing this. They tested it on blue whales and fin whales off of California. It also changed their singing, and they tested it on gray whales who were migrating, and the gray whales literally changed their migration route to get away from the sound. Again, you change a centuries-old migration route of an endangered species, that's not a good thing. So it definitely had an impact even at these lower levels. So we kind of got busy. It was clear to me that somebody had to do something, right? So I started, trying to put out the word about high-intensity active sonar and the effects on marine mammals. People didn't believe me in the beginning. People really, really did think I was crazy. I'm not making that up. They really did, because they just didn't believe me. So that lawsuit was filed in 1998, and in 2000, I think it was, there finally was a stranding in the Bahamas. There were a group of military vessels offshore doing sonar exercises, and whales started stranding on the beach. Ironically, they stranded on the beachfront property of a marine mammal scientist named Ken Balcom. How ironic is that? So here's Ken watching these whales strand, and he's like, what's going on here? So he gets up in an airplane and goes out and sees these ships out there. The other great thing is he called Darlene Ketton at Harvard, who was an expert on marine mammal hearing. She flew down. He preserved the heads of the whales in the freezers of nearby restaurants. Very smart, because we could never prove that the sound was making whales strand, because at that point there were strandings all around the world. There were strandings in Greece, there were strandings in the Caribbean, there were strandings many strandings in the Canary Islands, but it was very hard to prove that the sonar was making the whales strand and of course die. So he froze the heads of the whales in the freezers. Darlene Ketton came down, did necropsies, which is an autopsy on a whale, and found bleeding in their ears, bleeding in their brains. You're going to see a video in a minute about that. So it was the first proof that the sonar really caused the strandings and the death of the whales. Of course, what the Navy did when they wrote a paper about this, they said, these whales died from stranding. Didn't die from sonar, they died from stranding. So this constant attempt to not really, state what's actually happening. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, because I want to talk to you a little bit about why noise in the ocean is so dangerous for marine mammals and fish and for other creatures. Because let's face it, these beings that live in the water, what's their most important sense? Hearing, right? To us, our most important sense is vision, but you can't see very much underwater, so they get around by hearing. So everything depends on what they can hear in the oceans. If they can't hear, what's going to be affected? They're not going to be able to find food, they're not going to be able to find mates, they're not going to be able to stay together with their young as the calves got separated from their mothers, right? They're not going to be able to navigate. They're not going to be able to communicate with each other. They're not going to be able to avoid predators because they won't know where the predators are. They locate them, with sound. So they're pretty helpless. A friend of mine once wrote an article called "A Deaf Whale is a Dead Whale." And that's basically true. A deaf whale is eventually going to die because they're not going to be able to find food. So hearing is their most important sense. If we put a lot of sound in the ocean, what's going to happen? They can't hear these sounds that are essential for their survival. It's a phenomenon called masking. The loud sound masks the biologically important sounds that they need to survive. So as we put more and more human-produced noise in the ocean, we make it more and more difficult for marine mammals, for fish, because fish depend on all kinds of hearing as well, to be able to live their life the way they evolved to live their life. So that's why this became an issue for me, why I thought it was important, because it's going to affect not just whales and dolphins, but really all marine life in one way or another. You can imagine if you're living somewhere and there's this background noise going on and there's nothing you can do about it. And that was not that much noise. In some parts of the ocean, of course, it's going to be a lot noisier than that. So what happens when any being is exposed to that kind of noise? It has major impacts on your body. It's very stressful for land animals or marine mammals. It creates stress, and what stress does is it depresses your immune system, it lowers your reproductive rate, so that's why it's so detrimental to endangered species, because we want them to reproduce, but when they're stressed out, their reproductive rate actually gets lower. So it has very detrimental effects. They're more susceptible to all kinds of disease, etc., because their immune system is depressed. So that kind of stress, they find that birds, for example, that live near busy highways have lower reproductive rates than birds that live in quiet areas. So it's going to affect, land animals as well as these whales. So this kind of noise and the incredible increase in the amount of noise that we're putting into the ocean is going to be affecting the reproductive rate of just about every species that is there, that is in the ocean. So other things that noise does in the ocean, it has been shown to clearly make whales move away from places where they want to be to breed or rest. It's called displacement. So they get displaced from critical habitat. They, of course, as I said before, they may not be able to find food. They may not be able to find mates. They certainly can't communicate with each other. They also, they've actually been shown to literally move away from preferred feeding and breeding areas because they just can't stand to be there with all that noise. That's a huge impact on a population, moving away from preferred feeding and breeding areas. And then you get into other very serious things like noise causes temporary hearing loss, right? How many of you have gone to a concert and when you leave the concert, what happens? You know you can't hear as well right after the concert, right? That's temporary hearing loss. But if you're exposed to that noise for a long enough period of time and you can't get away from it, you're going to end up with permanent hearing loss, like some, you know, remember the rock musicians? They used to have, like Neil Young, he had all kinds of trouble with his hearing because he was, you know, producing loud music all the time. So that's what happens to the whales. They get permanent hearing loss, they get temporary hearing loss, and then, of course, what we think of as the most serious one, I don't know, I mean, I guess it is because it usually means death, is they literally strand. So this brings us back to the sonar issue, where the sonar was causing stranding. Nobody was believing that it was happening until that stranding in the Bahamas in 2000.
By way of background, Earthjustice has had an office here in Honolulu for 25 years. We celebrated our 25th anniversary last year. And it's really because of the work that Marcia and the Ocean Mammal Institute has done that we're involved in issues related to Navy and Navy sonar and its effect on marine mammals in the state. So prior to her contacting us back in 1998, we had not been involved in the issue. Something that we very quickly became interested in. And as far as we know, the lawsuit that we brought in 1998 on behalf of Ocean Mammal Institute and some other plaintiffs was the first lawsuit challenging the military's use of sonar. Unfortunately, in that particular case, we were unable to convince the judge that more needed to be done. In brief, the situation there was that the Navy was testing low-frequency active sonar and was in the process of preparing an environmental impact statement. But in order to get the data that they needed on the effects of this low-frequency sonar on marine mammals, they actually were using it on marine mammals. And we felt that they needed to do an environmental impact statement before they could do that. And unfortunately, the judge did not agree. But fast forward to the second round of litigation that Earthjustice did on behalf of Ocean Mammal Institute, starting in 2007 and through 2008, we brought litigation to challenge some undersea warfare exercises using mid-frequency active sonar. And in that case, we were successful in convincing the Hawaii District Court that the Navy was violating various environmental laws, including the National Environmental Policy Act, and the court issued an injunction that included a number of measures to protect marine mammals, and I think particularly significantly in the context of this latest effort, the Navy, I believe, in the briefing on what type of injunction should be imposed, volunteered that it should be prohibited from doing any sonar training that could affect any marine mammals in the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Sanctuary. Marine National Monument. The reason that's striking to me is that, fast forward now to the current situation, and as I will discuss, the Navy has refused to consider a similar limitation on its training and testing activities. It insists on its right to be able to train in virtually every square nautical mile of ocean between Hawaii and Southern California, and including all the waters around the state of Hawaii, with one sort of qualified exception that I'll discuss. And so, including the National Marine Sanctuary. So, we've taken a step backwards in terms of the Navy's willingness to be protective of marine mammals, and unfortunately a step backward that is being joined by the National Marine Fisheries Service, because they too are refusing to insist that the Navy create some reasonable no-train zones so that we can avoid some of the worst impacts to marine mammals and other marine life. So what I wanted to do tonight, is just give you a little bit of information about what we've been doing on behalf of the Ocean Mammal Institute in this latest litigation. We're also representing Animal Welfare Institute, Conservation Council for Hawaii, and the Center for Biological Diversity. I want to give you a little background on that, and then provide an opportunity, if the technology will allow, to give folks an opportunity to ask some questions if you want to know what we're doing. I don't want to assume that everyone who's listening has a law degree, but I also don't want to go get too basic. So if I say things that people need some clarification about, I'm happy to do that. So in terms of the lawsuit, the situation is that under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Navy needs authorization from the National Marine Fisheries Service to do any activities that have the potential to harm marine mammals. They also have an obligation under the Endangered Species Act to get authorization from the Fisheries Service before they take any actions that may adversely affect listed species. With respect to the training and testing that they propose to do over the next 5 years in Hawaii and Southern California and points in between, they admit, there's no question but that harm will be inflicted on marine mammals, including species that are listed as threatened and endangered. That also triggered their obligations under the Endangered Species Act. And then in addition to marine mammals, we have some serious concerns about effects of the Navy training and testing on sea turtles, which include endangered and threatened species, mainly in Hawaiian waters in this case, some in and around the areas where they train in Southern California. Simply put, in December, so just last month, the National Marine Fisheries Service came out with some rules about this training under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And those rules included authorization for the Navy to go forward with training and testing that by the agency's own estimation. So here, to be real clear, the numbers we're talking about are what the Navy came up with, what the Fisheries Service came up with. There are many, many responsible biologists out there who would take issue with these numbers and say that they dramatically underestimate the harm that this training and testing would inflict on marine mammals and other marine species. But for purposes of our lawsuit, we've just sort of taken them at their word and said, okay, even under your version of reality, what would happen here and what are your legal obligations? So the tally sheet that the Fisheries Service and the Navy came up with is that over the next 5 years, there's likely to be up to 155 marine mammals who are killed by the training. There's going to be over 2,000 additional marine mammals that will be permanently injured, most of them by being what's called a permanent threshold shift, which is a polite way of saying deafening permanently by the various training activities. And then, as I think was mentioned right before I was introduced, there will be 9.6 million instances in which marine mammals will be exposed to noise that will inflict a lesser degree of harm on them, either temporarily deafening them or at a minimum substantially interfering with vital behaviors, things that they need to do to survive, including eating, resting, mating, avoiding predators, all sorts of things that really have an existential threat to marine mammals who rely on being able to hear in order to survive. And when you have a number like 9.6 million, you have to realize that that far exceeds the number of marine mammals that are in the area that's being affected. So it's not really 9.6 million individuals that will be hurt. It's 9.6 times when individual animals will be hurt. And that's actually worse, because it means that in various cases, you will have individual animals who are subjected repeatedly to these types of acoustic assaults, and just hounding them as they're trying to go about their existence. And those cumulative effects really can be harmful to the individual's ability to survive, thrive, reproduce, and do all the things that they need to do in order for the species to be able to make it. So, one of the initial issues that we had with this authorization is that prior to determining to give the authorization to this very high level of harm to marine mammals, both the Navy and the Fisheries Service had an obligation under the National Environmental Policy Act to do an environmental review in which they looked not only what the Navy wanted to do, but if there were alternative ways that the Navy could accomplish its training, accomplish its testing, go about its mission, but do that while inflicting less harm on marine species, including marine mammals. Because the National Environmental Policy Act is based on this very fundamental idea that good decisions are made by government when you have good information, and that to develop that good information, you have to do it publicly. You can't do it behind closed doors. You need to put your analyses out for public review and comment, including review and comment by experts in marine mammals outside of the agency's staff, and allow people to scrutinize that in an open way so that you can put on the table for everyone to see, the agencies, the public, elected officials, what the options are. And the National Environmental Policy Act doesn't say that the Navy or the Fisheries Service need to pick the least harmful option. It just requires them to be honest about it, on the assumption that in a democracy, we the people will be looking over their shoulders, and if they're making decisions that we don't approve of, we have an opportunity to influence our elected officials and hopefully get them to do something different. I'll talk in a little bit about the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. They actually do insist that the Fisheries Service require the Navy to minimize the amount of impact to marine mammals, but I'll get into that in a moment. With respect to the National Environmental Policy Act, it just says, let's know what these alternatives are. And if you'll recall what I said about the litigation we brought in 2007 and 2008, even there, the Navy voluntarily, well, not voluntarily, but when it was found to have violated the laws and was asked by the judge, okay, well, while you're complying with the law, what sort of limitations should there be on training? Even it said, well, yeah, we can stay out of Hawaiian National Monument. Well, now, only about 5 years later, they're refusing even to consider that. So none of the alternatives that were addressed in the environmental impact statement would have created areas that were completely off limits to Navy training. This, despite the fact that in the intervening years, we've learned a lot about the impacts of sonar on marine mammals. We know that the levels of harm happen at much lower levels of sound than had previously been believed. And we also have increasing and improved knowledge about areas that are particularly important to marine mammals in Hawaii and Southern California waters, areas that the agency calls biologically important areas. They've got working groups coming up, gathering data and doing research, collecting research, and then posting on their website locations where individual stocks and species of marine mammals tend to congregate, and it's just only sensible that you would consider an alternative or a series of alternatives where one or more of these areas would be off limits to training, because the most severe impacts, whether you're talking about the impact of a sonar blast or an explosive blast or a ship strike, all of these serious impacts happen when Navy training and testing is happening in close proximity to marine mammals. So if you want to bring down the numbers from these extraordinary levels that the Fisheries Service authorized, it's only logical that you would look at, okay, well, what would the effect be of saying that the National Marine Monument is off limits? What would be the effect of putting off limits, let's say, the west coast of Hawaii Island, which if you go onto the cetacean mapping website and you click on the link for biologically important areas in Hawaii, you'll see for very, very many species, the west side of Hawaii Island is just core habitat. And what the Fisheries Service and the Navy have said in their public statements is, yeah, we thought about that, we considered that, but then we concluded that it really wouldn't confer all that much benefit. It really wasn't worth the bother, and so we didn't pursue that. Well, the problem with that is that under the National Environmental Policy Act, that evaluation is required by law to be done publicly, so that we can see what they consider to be not a significant amount of benefit to the marine mammals. We can see what it is that they could do but they're not doing. And equally importantly, independent experts, folks who don't work for the agencies, don't work for the Navy, don't work for the Fisheries Service, they can weigh in and say, hey, I think you maybe got this wrong. It would be really substantially important to put this area or that area off limits to training. Instead of that, the only thing the Navy and Fisheries Service looked at, and the only thing required, is the creation of a small, what they call cautionary area in a subset of the sanctuary, the Humpback Marine Sanctuary. So not the entire thing, mind you, but in a portion of it, right around Maui and the waters south of Maui. In that portion, no training would happen during the time when humpbacks are present, unless the commander of the Navy in the Pacific, an individual who has absolutely no biological training, that's not his job description, he gets to decide if it's important to do training in that area, and in unreviewable and unilateral discretion can say whatever training can happen without the Fisheries Service being able to do anything about it. So, to wrap it up, the initial challenge that we brought back last month, right after the Fisheries Service released these regulations, was one challenging their failure under the National Environmental Policy Act to examine alternatives in an open and transparent way, and to look at putting areas off limits so we could bring down the number of, particularly of the mortalities and the serious permanent injuries. Then, as Marcia may have mentioned just this morning, we amended that complaint. Now that we have the benefit of reviewing the regulations that were issued in December, under the regulations they issue things called letters of authorization, which actually give the green light for training and testing. And then also looking at the biological opinion. It's an almost 500-page document, so it took a little time to look through that. And so this morning we amended the complaint because it's clear that they're violating additional laws. And also, in the intervening time, on December 20th, the Navy relied on the deficient environmental impact statement to give the green light to its training. So we've now sued the Navy for violating the National Environmental Policy Act for the same reasons I just described for the Fisheries Service. And we have added claims against the Fisheries Service under the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. And in a nutshell, what those claims say is that there are certain legal standards that those laws apply that limit the discretion of the Fisheries Service to authorize harmful conduct. So under the Endangered Species Act, the Fisheries Service cannot allow any action that would the legal term is jeopardize, but basically what that means is increase the likelihood of the extinction of a species. And under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Fisheries Service cannot allow harm associated with an activity if it would have more than and the legal term is, quote, negligible impact. Basically, if it would have a population level impact, then it's not legally permissible to give out authorization to do that activity. And with respect to both of these statutes, we just analyzed the huge amount of harm including mortalities, that were authorized against some very, very imperiled species, as well as some stocks of marine mammals that are very limited in number. In particular, a lot of the resident populations of marine mammals that are resident to either individual Hawaiian Islands or the Hawaiian Islands as a whole. You know, there may be many of these species, for example, false killer whales. There may be a lot of them in the world, but the insular false killer whale is separately listed as an endangered species. It's only found in the Hawaiian Islands, and there's only about 150 animals in the water. And so, you know, the amount of harm that they authorize and potentially could be inflicted on these types of very limited resident populations poses some serious questions about whether these species will be able to survive, or at a minimum, under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, whether there will be population level effects that go beyond the effects on individuals. And based on everything that we reviewed, it's pretty clear the Fisheries Service never bothered to do any meaningful analysis about what the effects of giving out these levels of take would be on these individual species and stocks. And that violates the Endangered Species Act, and that violates the Marine Mammal Protection Act. The last thing that I want to say with respect to this, you may recall that I mentioned that under the National Environmental Policy Act, there may be less harmful alternatives that are examined, and then the agency is free to say, well, I'm going to go with the more harmful one because that's the one that I prefer. Not so under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which places a duty on the National Marine Fisheries Service when it authorizes harm to marine mammals to ensure that whatever it authorizes, it affects these marine mammals as little as is possible. There's a similar mandate under the Endangered Species Act. And so one of the things we're trying to accomplish through the lawsuit, in forcing them to go back and do a revised environmental impact statement that looks at alternatives, is that very process will help determine whether under the Marine Mammal Protection Act or the Endangered Species Act, they really have to put certain places off limits to training in order to comply with those statutes. So it's not just a paper exercise to go back and look at alternatives that maybe the Navy would rather not do, but actually it has some really significant legal implications. If there are alternatives out there that would reduce the number of injuries, reduce the number of mortalities, and the Fisheries Service failed to implement those.
So I would like to remind everybody to write your letters to the editor of the Maui News, the Star Advertiser, every newspaper that you can think of. I think it's great to inundate those newspapers. I think it's important to try to keep this issue in front of everybody in Hawaii, because Hawaii, I just love Hawaii. I mean, I've been coming here since 1985, usually several times a year. So I feel like I'm, almost a resident. But when I look at the determination and tenacity of people in Hawaii to make effective, important environmental change, it's very inspiring to me. In Hawaii tend to be activists, and I want to encourage you all to, get out there, write your letters to your congressmen, write to the editors. I have some idea, and please keep track of us on Facebook and get all your friends to go on Facebook so that, whether or not they're from Hawaii, because, it's only the people of this country that are going to make things change. Okay, so this is what I keep telling my students, and now I'm telling everybody else who's not my student the same thing. I mean, we're the only ones that can change anything. We're the only ones that can stop this kind of abuse to the environment and to living organisms. We're the only ones that can help these people get their heads connected to their hearts. It's this disconnect between the mind and the heart, and we have to be in our hearts as much as we are in our heads. We've got to get them connected. They've been disconnected in many people. So, stay in contact with us. You can always email me at, what's the email? oceanmammalinst.org, right? You can send me emails there, oceanmammalinst.org. It's up on my website, Ocean Mammal Institute. I have some ideas about things that I think we could be doing. I mean, I think it's pretty egregious that this noise is going to be coming into not just this sanctuary, but there are a lot of sanctuaries off of Southern California, right? And I'm thinking I'm going to start a campaign really to get all the sanctuaries talking about this, because the head of all the National Marine Sanctuaries, Dan Basta in DC, I think back in 2008, issued a statement that all National Marine Sanctuaries should be mitigating or decreasing the amount of noise in the sanctuary. So the sanctuaries have a leg to stand on here. We're told to decrease the amount of noise. So we need to be, getting the sanctuaries involved and saying, hey, we don't think this is acceptable. So I think that's one thing I'm going to be working on, is getting all the sanctuaries working together. So if you have any ideas, any discussions you want to have, feel free to contact us. And thank you very much for coming tonight.